Hi guys, it's Marty here, and in this video I'm going to show you how to build a professional WordPress website step by step. See, I've been using WordPress for about 10 years now, and I decided to make this WordPress tutorial to show you everything you'll need to know in order to build a website you can be proud of. You don't need to have any previous design skills, we won't be using any coding, and it's only going to take us about 60 minutes to complete. So if you need a website for your business, or maybe you just want to build a website for fun, this is how you do it. I'm going to walk you through the entire process, step by step, and in a way that anyone should be able to understand. But rather than just talking about it, let's take a look at the actual website we're going to be building. So I'm going to show you how to add your logo here at the top, and how to change the site colors and fonts. Then we're going to have this large header on our home page, which consists of a few lines of text, 2 buttons, and a background image. Then under this we can add images, text, headings, buttons, and anything else we might want on our home page. Then we can create as many pages as we need, and in any style we like. Then we can add our pages to the menu at the top, along with this action button, and we can link this button to whatever we like. Then we'll also be adding a form to our contact page, so our visitors can send us a message if they need to, and these messages will be sent to us as an email. This website's also going to be 100% mobile friendly, which means it's going to look amazing on any device. So if I just make this window a little smaller, we can see what our website will look like on a tablet. Then if we make it a little smaller again, this is what our website's going to look like when being viewed on a mobile phone. So no matter what device it's being viewed on, it's always going to look great. Now, you're probably not going to be building a website about coffee, like my example site, but don't worry, this is going to work for almost any kind of business or website you might need. So here's the same website with different images and branding, just to give you an idea of what I mean. And as you can see, the website's pretty much always going to look great. So if you're ready to get started, this is how to build a professional WordPress website step by step. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is register a domain name and web hosting for our new website. And for anyone who doesn't know already, a domain name is usually the title of a website or business with www before it and .com after it. So a domain name is what we type into our internet browser to visit a specific website. Then web hosting is where the different files that make up our website will be stored online, so people can gain access to our website even when our own computer's switched off. Now, there are tons of different places we can get these from, but I personally recommend a company called HostGator. I've been using them for years now without any problems. They're a well-known hosting company with affordable pricing and great support, which is exactly what we want when getting started. So we just need to open up our internet browser and go to HostGator.com. Then we're going to hover over where it says hosting at the top and click shared hosting. And this is going to show us the 3 different hosting plans they offer. Now, to be totally honest with you, the business plan comes with a whole load of added extras we're probably not going to need when just getting started, so really that just leaves it between the hatchling plan and the baby plan. And the only real difference between these 2 plans is the amount of websites we can have with each one. So with the hatchling plan we can have 1 single website, and with the baby plan we can have as many websites as we like. Then once we've decided on which plan we're going to go for, we can click Buy Now underneath. That's going to bring us to this page, and this is where we're going to register the domain name for our new website. So we just need to type whatever we want to register as our domain name into this box at the top. And for my example, I'm going to type website about coffee. Then on the right we can choose our domain extension, and for this example I'm going to choose .com. So the domain name I'm registering here would be websiteaboutcoffee.com. Then as long as the domain name's available, it's going to say primary domain here, but if it comes up and says the domain's not available, unfortunately we'll need to choose something else. Then as long as our domain's available, we can scroll down to where it says Domain Privacy Protection. Now this is an optional add-on, and I normally just uncheck this box myself and haven't had any problems to date. But if you're trying to keep your website totally anonymous, just leave this box checked and it'll be added to your bill. Then underneath it says choose a hosting plan. And here we just want to double check our package type is correct and choose a billing cycle. So I went for the hatchling plan in this example, so this is correct. And then here on the right we can choose how often we'd like to pay for our hosting. Now obviously this is going to depend on how much money you have to spend on your website, but I'd recommend setting this to 12 months or higher if you can. And not only because we get a great discount compared to monthly billing, but we also get a domain name for free if we go for 12 months or higher up front. And with that being said, I'm going to set mine to 12 months. Then once we're done here, we can scroll down, and here we just want to enter our email address and password, and then create a security PIN for our account. And then under this we can enter our personal billing information, so things like our name and address. And then on the right we can choose how we'd like to pay for our order, and we can choose either credit or debit card or PayPal. Then once we're done here, if we scroll down, we'll see a section called Add Additional Services. And these are just some added extras that HostGator offer. Personally, I don't want any of these, so I'm just going to leave them unchecked. But you can have a read through them yourself and check the box beside any you want and they'll be added to your bill. Then under this we'll see a place to enter a coupon code if we have one. And there might already be one entered in here, worth 20 or 25% off. But if we delete this, and instead type in WP Building, when we click Validate, we'll see that our hosting is now even cheaper, and we're getting both our domain name and web hosting for less than $40. And remember that this is for the full year, which means it's going to cost us less than $3.50 a month to run our website, which is awesome. Now, I would just like to mention that as well as you getting a great discount on your hosting, I'll also be paid a small commission from HostGator if you click through my link or use my coupon code to make a purchase. Any money made from this will go towards creating more tutorials like this one, so thank you in advance if you use the coupon. But even if you don't, I'd still highly recommend using HostGator for your website. But anyway, let's get back to the tutorial. So once we're done here, we just want to double check our order and make sure everything's correct. Then we're going to scroll down to the bottom, check this box to agree to their terms, and then click Checkout Now. So if you're following along at home, you can pause this video now and pay for your order. Then come back and press play when you're finished, and we'll carry on building our website together. Okay, so that's me now back, and after paying for our order, we'll find ourselves logged into the HostGator dashboard, which is where we'll be installing WordPress. So from this screen, we're going to click where it says Launch cPanel here on the right. And this is going to open up the HostGator cPanel. Then we're going to type WordPress into the search bar at the top. And then click on WordPress Manager by 𝗗𝗓𝗏𝗧𝗢𝗏𝗧𝗏𝗏𝗧𝗏𝗏𝗧𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 Now we need to click Install, and this is going to open up the WordPress installer. Here we just want to make sure the new domain name that we registered is selected in this box, and the box beside it is left blank. Then underneath we can enter our site name and our site description. But don't worry too much about these for now, as we can always change them again later. Then on the right we're going to enter the username and password we want to use for logging into our WordPress site. And then under this we can update our email address. Then once we're done here, we're going to leave everything else as it is, scroll down to the very bottom, and click Install. HostGator is then going to install WordPress for us onto our new domain name, and this will usually take less than a minute. Once it's finished, it'll say congratulations, the software was installed successfully. At this point we can click the link beside where it says admin URL, which is going to open up the WordPress dashboard. And this is where we can add any content or make any changes to our new WordPress site, which is now live online. All we need to do to visit it is click our site title in the top left, and this is going to show us what WordPress looks like when we first install it. And don't worry if yours looks a little different than mine, as sometimes they change up the default theme. But either way, it's just going to have some demo content on it for now, but it's ready for us to start customizing and adding content to. And now that we have WordPress installed, the next thing we're going to do is delete the demo content so we can start off with a fresh installation. To do this, we just need to go back to the dashboard by clicking our site title in the top left. Then we're going to click into Pages on the left, and this will show us any pages we have on our site, which at the moment are just a few demo pages that we don't need, so we're going to delete them. To do this, we just need to hover our mouse over the page name, and then click Trash. And then we can do the same thing for any other pages in this list. Then once we're done here, we're going to delete some demo plugins that come pre-installed, and these are basically like apps for WordPress. So we need to click where it says Plugins on the left. And here we're going to see any plugins we have installed, which at the moment are just some demo plugins we don't need. So to remove these, we're going to check the box in the top left to select all of the plugins in this list. Then we can change this drop-down menu to Deactivate and click Apply. Then once the plugins have been deactivated, we're going to check this box in the top left to select them all again, change this drop-down menu to Delete, and click Apply. And at this point, WordPress is going to delete all of the plugins in this list. And now that we've removed the demo content, we're going to move on to the next step, which is installing a WordPress theme. This is going to change the entire look of our WordPress site and make it more like the website we're trying to create. So to install a theme, we're going to click where it says Appearance on the left. And this is going to show us any themes we have installed. And as we can see, I'm currently using a theme called 2022, as it's the one that says active. But we're going to be installing a new theme instead. To do this, we just need to click where it says Add New at the top, and this will show us all of the free themes that WordPress have to offer. Now for this tutorial, we're going to be using a theme I really like called Astra. So we just need to type the word Astra into the search bar in the top right. Then when it shows up, we're going to hover our mouse over the theme and click Install. It's only going to take a few seconds to install, And once it's done, we can click Activate. Then once the theme is active, we can visit our site by clicking our site title in the top left. And we'll see that our site now looks completely different. But we still have a few more things to do before it starts to look like the website we saw at the start. So the next thing we're going to do is install a free plugin, which is going to help us to build our site much quicker and make the whole process a lot easier. To do this, we just need to visit the dashboard by clicking our site title in the top left. Then we're going to click into Plugins on the left, and then click Add New at the top. Now we're going to type the words Starter Templates into the search bar in the top right. Then when it shows up, we're going to install this plugin by Brainstorm Force. And to do this, we just need to click Install. It's only going to take a few seconds to install the plugin, and then when it's done, we can click Activate. Then once the plugin's active on our site, we're going to click here where it says See Library. Then we're going to click Build Your Website Now at the bottom, and then choose the block editor from these three options. And this is going to show us all of the different templates we can choose from. The one I used for the example website at the start of this video was called Mountain, so we just need to type the word mountain into the search bar at the top. Then when it shows up, we're going to click on it, and this will load a preview of the website on the right, and then we'll be guided through a few different options here on the left. So first we can upload a logo image if we have one, or if we don't, we can click Skip and Continue at the bottom. But I'm going to use one in this example. So to upload our logo, we're going to click Upload Files here, and then click Select Files in the middle. Now we just need to find the image on our computer, click on it, and click Open. Then once it's been uploaded, we're going to click Select in the bottom right. And at this point, we'll see that our logo now appears in the preview on the right. Then if we want to adjust the size of our logo, we can use this slider on the left. Then once we're happy with everything here, we can click Continue at the bottom. And then here on the left, we can choose the default colors we want to use for our website. So we can click through these different presets, and we'll see the colors update in real time in the preview on the right. Now I'm just going to put mine back to the original colors, but you can pick whatever colors you like best. And we don't need to worry too much about these for now, as I'll also be covering how to change most of the individual colors later on in this video. Then once we're done with our site colors, we can choose what fonts we'd like to use. And just like with the colors, we can click through the different presets on the left, and we'll see our fonts update on the right. And I'm going to choose this one for my example. Then once we're happy with our colors and fonts, we can click Continue at the bottom. Then on this screen, we don't need to fill out the personal information here, but we are going to uncheck this box beside where it says Import Widgets. Then we're going to click Submit and build my website, and this is only going to take about a minute. Then once it's done, we can click View Your Website, and just like that, we'll be brought to our new website. Now obviously we need to change up the content and make it our own, but our new website's already looking awesome, and it's only taken us a few minutes. So we now have this awesome looking homepage with our text and images and buttons. Then if we scroll back up to the top, we also have these other pages in our menu as well. And now we just need to update the content on each of these pages. But just quickly before that, we do need to change something first to make sure our logo shows up correctly. Now mine is showing up fine as I'm on my laptop, but if you're on a Mac or Retina screen, you might find that it's still showing the demo logo. So to make sure our logo shows up for everyone, we just need to click where it says Customize here at the top. And this is going to open up our theme options on the left. And then we'll see a live preview of our website on the right. Now we're going to click into where it says Header Builder on the left. And then click into Site Title and Logo. Then here we're just going to turn off this switch beside where it says Different Logo for Retina Devices. And then click the back pointing arrow in the top left. Now we're going to click into Transparent Header at the bottom. And then turn off the switch beside Different Logo for Retina Devices. Now we just need to click Publish up at the top to save our changes. And then we can click the X in the top left to close out of these options. And at this point we'll see our logo now appears at the top if it wasn't showing already. And now that we're done with our logo, we can start changing the content on our pages. And we're going to be starting with the home page, which is the first page people will come to when they visit our website. So to do this, we just need to make sure we're on our home page by clicking Home in our menu. Then we're going to click where it says Edit Page at the top. And this is going to open up the WordPress editor. So here at the top we have our page title, which says Home at the moment, and we can change this if we like, but I'm just going to leave it as it is. Then under this we have the different content that appears on our page, and the first thing we have here is this main header, which has a few lines of text, 2 buttons, and a background image. To change any of the text, we just need to click into it with our mouse, delete what's already here, and then type whatever we like. Then we can do the same thing for the subheading above. And then the text underneath. Then say we wanted to remove one of these lines of text. We just need to click on the one we're wanting to remove. Then we're going to click the 3 dots on the right side of this menu. And then click Remove Heading at the bottom. And this is going to delete it from the editor. But if we ever do something like this and then regret it, we can click the back arrow in the top left of our screen to undo it and bring it back. But I'm just going to click the Redo button to remove it again, as I don't really want it. Then we can also change the color of our text if we like. To do this, we just need to click on the text we're wanting to change, and then if we look over on the right, under where it says Color, we can click on Text, and here we can choose from our theme colors, or if we want to use a different color, we can click into this box at the top, and choose our color here. And when we change our color, we'll see that it updates in the editor on the left. But I'm just going to put my text back to white in this example. Then once we're happy with our text, we can update our buttons. So first we can just change the button text to whatever we want, and for this example I'm going to link my first button to my contact page, so I'm going to type Get in Contact for my button text. Then if we look on the right, we can change our button colors. So I'm going to click into Text here and change mine to white. And when I do this, we'll see it updates on the left. Then under Text on the right, we can click into Background. And I'm going to make my background color orange in this example. But I want it a little darker than this, so I'm going to click into this box here at the top and change it to be a bit darker. and we'll see this update on the left. Then once we're happy with how our button looks, we can link it to one of our pages. To do this, we just need to click on the button, and then click this little chain link icon in the menu above it. Now we can just start typing the name of one of our pages into this box, and as I'm linking to my contact page, I'm going to type the word contact in here. But say for example you wanted to link to your services page, you would just type the word services instead. Then once it shows up, we just need to click on the page to add the link. Now we are going to be covering how to add new pages later on in this tutorial, so if you're wanting to link this button to a page we haven't created yet, you might want to make yourself a note to come back and link it later. And now we're finished with our first button, we can move on to the second one. So first we can change the button text, and for mine, I'm just going to type second button. Then I'm actually going to leave the colours the way they are, as I think the default looks pretty good. But you can change the colours over on the right if you want to. Then to link our button, we just need to click on it in the editor, and then click this chain link icon in the menu above it. Then if we want to link to another page on our own site, we can just type the page name into this box like we did with the first one, and then click on the page to add the link. But say we wanted to link to another website instead of a page on our own site, we just need to open up a new tab in our internet browser, and find the website or video or whatever we're wanting to link to. And I'm just going to link to a random tutorial on how to make a cup of coffee for my example. Then once we get here, we just need to right click and copy the URL at the top, and then we can close out of it again. Now we're going to paste the URL we just copied into this box, and then click the enter icon to the right to link it. Then when we're linking to another website, we also want to turn on this switch beside where it says open in new tab, and this will make sure our website is kept open in the background when someone clicks on the button. Then say we only wanted one of these buttons, we just need to click on the one we don't want, then click the three dots to the right side of this menu, and then click remove button at the bottom. And when we do this, we'll see the buttons now gone. But I'm just going to click the back arrow in the top left to undo this, as I want to keep it. And now that we've updated our buttons, we can change the background image. To do this, we just need to click on the background image, and then click where it says replace in the menu above it. Now we're going to click upload, search for the image we're wanting to use on our computer, click on it and click open. And we'll see the image updates in the editor. Now you might have noticed that the image isn't the same colour as it was before we uploaded it, and that's because there's an overlay colour for our background image. To change this, we just need to click on the background image, then if we look over on the right and scroll down, we'll see it says overlay, and below this we can click on colour and change the colour to whatever we want. And for this example, I'm going to make mine black. Then under this we'll see it says opacity, which at the moment is set to 50%. But if we change this to 0, it'll turn the overlay off, and then if we turn it to 100%, it'll become a solid colour. Personally, I'm going to set mine to 20%, but you can set yours to whatever you like. Then if we ever want to preview our page to see how it's looking so far, we just need to click where it says preview in the top right, then click preview in new tab, and this is going to open up a preview of our page. And here we're going to see that our header's been updated, and personally I think it's looking much better. So we have our text, and our background image, And if I click on my first button, it's going to bring me to my contact page. Then if we go back and click on the second button, we'll see this one opens in a new tab as I turned on that switch. Now we can close out of the preview and make any changes to our content if we need to. But personally, I'm happy with how mine looked in the preview, so I'm going to keep it as it is. Then once we're done with this section, we can scroll down to the next one. And here we have 3 images with text overlays. So just like we did in the section above, we can change the text by clicking into it, deleting what's here, and then typing whatever we like. Then once we're done, we can change the text color if we like, over on the right. So under where it says color, we're going to click into text, and then choose the color we want. And I'm going to make mine dark blue, which I realize doesn't look that great at the moment, but it should look a lot better in a second when I change the background image. Then to change our background image, we just need to click on it, and then click Replace in the menu above it. Now we're going to click Upload, find the image on our computer, click on it, and click Open. And as always, we'll see the image changes in the editor. Then say we wanted to change the position of this text, we just need to click on the background image, and then click this symbol in the menu above it. Now we can change the position here. And for my example, I'm going to put mine at the bottom. Then the last thing we need to do here is change the color of our overlay. So over on the right, if we scroll down, under where it says Overlay, we're going to click on Color, and then choose the color we want. Then once we're happy with the color, we can change the opacity underneath using this slider, and I'm actually going to put mine to 0 in this example to turn it off. And when I do this, we'll see it updates on the left. And my dark blue text is now looking better as well. Then once we're happy with our first one, we just need to follow the same steps to update the other 2. But to save some time, I'm just going to do this. And just in case you're wondering where I got these images from, I created them myself using 𝗗𝗎𝗦𝗧𝗏. Then once we're done here and we're happy with our 3 images and our overlay text, we can scroll down to the next section. And here we have a text heading on the left, and then some text and a button on the right. So first we can change the heading text to whatever we like. Then to change the color, we're going to click where it says Text over on the right, and then choose the color we want. Then once we're happy with our heading, we can update our text on the right in the same way. But to save some time, I'm just going to paste in some text I already have copied. Then under our text we have this button, and we can link it to a page on our own site or another website like we did with the other buttons above, but I'm going to remove this one instead for my example. So to remove a button, we just need to click on it, then click the 3 dots to the right of this menu, and then click Remove Button at the bottom. Then once we're done here, we can scroll down to the next section, and here we have what's known as a call to action, which consists of some text and a button. So first we just need to update the heading text. Then we can change the text color if we want over here on the right. but I'm going to leave mine as it is. Now, you might notice that the text is in all lowercase, even if we try to add in capital letters. And that's because it's using something called text transform to keep it all in lowercase. But if we want to change this, we just need to click on the text. Then if we look over on the right, under where it says typography, we have a few different options. First, we can change the size of the text if we like. So if I click on 13, we'll see it gets way smaller in the editor. And if I click on 42, it gets much bigger. Then if we want to go back to the default size, we just need to click this icon here, and then delete the number from this box. And when we do this, we'll see it goes back to the original size. Then under the size option on the right, we also have letter case. And here we can choose all uppercase, all lowercase, and then the last option here will add a capital letter to the start of every word. Then once we're happy with our heading, we can change the other text. And now we can update our button. I'm going to link this button to my contact page, so I'm going to change the text to say Get in Contact. Then once we've added the text, we can change the button colors. So under where it says color on the right, I'm going to click into text and change this to be white. Then under this I'm going to click into background and change this to dark grey. And we'll see that the colors have updated in the editor. Then to link the button, we just need to click on it, and then click the chain link icon in the menu above it. Now we can either type the page name or paste whatever URL we're wanting to link to into this box, and as I'm linking to my contact page, I'm going to type the word contact in here. And then we just need to click on the page to add the link. And as I'm linking to a page on my own site, I'm going to leave this switch turned off. And once again, you might want to make a note to come back and link this button later if you're planning on adding a new page to link it to. And now that we've updated our button, we can change the background image. And you might have noticed that if we scroll over this image, it has this cool scrolling effect, which is known as a parallax effect. If we want to turn this off, we just need to click on the background image, and then turn off this switch on the right, beside where it says Fixed Background. And this will turn it back into a static image. But I'm going to turn it back on in my example, as I think it looks nice. Then to change the background image itself, we're just going to click on it, and then click Replace at the top. Now we're going to click Upload, find the image on our computer, click on it, and click Open. And once it's updated, if we scroll a little, we should see the parallax effect is still active on our new image. And now we're going to change our overlay color. So we need to click on the image, and then over on the right, under Overlay, we can click Color. And then choose our color. Then under Color on the right, we can also change the opacity. Then once we're done here, we can preview our page to see how it looks. So we just need to click where it says Preview in the top right, and then click Preview in New tab. So here at the top we have our main heading, with our text and buttons. Then under this we have our 3 images with text overlays. Then we have our text and text heading. And now we also have our call to action with our text and button. And when we scroll past it, it also has this cool parallax effect. And we can just double check our buttons working. And then we can use the back button in our browser to go back. Then once we're done here, we can close out of the preview. and make any edits to our content if we need to. Then, once we're happy with our call to action, we can scroll down to the next section. And here we'll see we have 6 images. This section would be great for showing off some portfolio items or something like that if we wanted to. And if we do, we just need to replace the images in the same way as before by clicking on the image and then clicking Replace. But I'm actually going to remove this whole section in my example. So to remove a section we don't want, we just need to click the 3 lines icon in the top left to open up the list view. Then we want to close any open sections by clicking the down pointing arrow to the left, and this will just make it a little easier. So each of these represent a different section on our page. And to remove one, we're just going to hover our mouse over the one we don't want, which for me is the last one in the list. And at this point over on the right, we'll see a blue outline around the entire section when we hover over it. Then to remove it, we're going to click the 3 dots to the right, and then click Remove Group at the bottom. And when we do this, we'll see the section is now gone. And remember, if we ever make a mistake or remove the wrong section, we can use this back arrow in the top left to undo the last thing we did. Then once we're done here, we can click this X to close out of the list view. And now if we preview our page again, if we scroll down to the bottom, we'll see that the portfolio section is now gone. But we aren't limited to the sections that came with the template. There are actually hundreds of other sections we can use. And we can add as many sections to our pages as we like. So to add a new section, we just need to close out of the preview. Then we're going to click where it says Template Kits in the top left. And then click into Patterns at the top. And here we'll see all the different pre-made sections we can add to our pages. Then if we look over on the left, we can filter them by color. So if I click where it says light, it's only going to show us the ones with a light background. Or if I click dark, it'll only show us the dark ones. And I'm going to choose light for mine. Then under this we can click through the different categories on the left until we find the one we like. Then over on the right we can pick the section we want to add to our page, and obviously you can spend a little longer looking through these, but I'm just going to choose this one for my example. Then once we find the one we want to use, we just need to hover our mouse over it and click Import. And at this point it'll be added to the bottom of our page in the editor. Then once we've added our new section, we just need to update the content in the same way we've been doing. So first we can update any text we have, but to save some time, I'm just going to do this. Then we can change our text colors over on the right if we like, but I'm just going to leave mine the way they are. Then once we're done with our text, we can update any images we have, and to do this we just need to click on the image we're wanting to change, and then click Replace in the menu above it. Then we need to click Upload, search for the image on our computer, click on it, and click Open. And as always, we'll see the image changes in the editor. And then we just need to do the same thing for any other images we have in our new section. Then once we're happy with our new section, we can add another one if we like, but I'm only going to add one in my example. Then once we've added any new sections we want, we can also change the order of them on our page. So to change the order of our sections, we just need to click anywhere on the one we're wanting to move. Then we need to click this icon to the left of our menu, and we need to click on it a few times until it shows these 2 overlapping squares, and the entire row is outlined in blue. And that means it's all selected. And now we can use these up and down arrows to move it up and down our page. But I'm actually going to put it back to the bottom again in my example. Then once we're happy with the position of our section, we can preview our page one last time, just to make sure everything looks good before we publish it. So to do this, we just need to click Preview in the top right, and then click Preview in New tab. And now if we scroll down, we'll see our new section has been added to our page, and it's also in the new position if we moved it. Then once we're done, we can close out of the preview and make any changes to our content if we need to. But I'm pretty happy with how mine looked in the preview, so I'm just going to leave it as it is. Then once we're finished adding content to our page, we can publish it. To do this, we just need to click where it says Update in the top right. And now if we click View Page in the bottom left, we'll see that all of the changes we made are now live on our site. And now we're finished with our home page, we can move on to the next page in our menu, which is our About page. But just quickly before that, if you've been enjoying the video so far, please be sure to give it a like here on YouTube to show your support. Not only would it mean a lot to me, but it also shows YouTube that people like my content and helps get my video promoted more in the searches. It'll only take you 2 seconds to hit the like button, but I'd really appreciate it if you did. But anyway, let's get back to our website. So now that we've finished with our home page, we can move on to the next page in our menu, which is our About page. And this is where we can tell our visitors a little bit about ourselves and our business. So we just need to click where it says Edit Page at the top to open it up in the editor. And now we can update the content. So we can update the text and images, and add or remove any sections we like in the same way as we did with our home page. But to save some time, I'm just going to do this. But if you need a reminder of anything we've covered so far, I'm going to add the timestamps for everything in the description below, so you can just skip back and forward to the exact bit you need. Then once we're happy with our page, we just need to click Update in the top right to publish our changes, and then click View Page in the bottom left. And we'll see that our changes are now live. And just for reference, all I did was change the text to say About Us, then I changed the background image and the overlay color at the top, then I removed the other 2 sections that were here before, and then added 3 new ones. The first one is just a text heading and some text. Then the second one has an image to the left and some text to the right. And then the last one has some text and a button. Which is all simple stuff that we've already covered. Then once we're happy with our About page, the next page in our menu is called Services. And this is where we can show off any services we plan to offer. So we just need to click into Services in the menu, and then click Edit Page at the top to open it up in the editor. Then we can edit the content in the same way as we did with our home page and our About page. So we can update the text, images, and buttons, and add or remove any sections we want. But for my example, I'm actually going to delete this page, as I'm not planning to offer any services on this site. So if you don't want one of the default pages, this is how to remove it. We just need to visit the dashboard by clicking our site title in the top left. Then we're going to click into Pages on the left. And this is going to show us all of the pages we have on our website. So as I'm wanting to delete my services page, I'm going to hover my mouse over that one and click Trash. Then once the page has been deleted, we can visit our site again by clicking our site title in the top left. And at this point we'll see the page has also been removed from our menu as well. Then say we wanted to add a new page in its place, we just need to visit the dashboard again by clicking our site title in the top left. Then we're going to hover over Pages on the left and click Add New. And this is going to open up the editor for our new page. Then here at the top we can give our page a name, and for my example I'm going to call mine Types of Coffee. Then once we've given it a name, if we preview our page, we'll see that it doesn't quite look right. And that's because our other pages were created using the plugin we installed earlier. So when we create a new page, there are a few settings we need to change in the editor. So we just need to close out of the preview. Then we're going to click the A icon in the top right to open up the Astra theme options. And then here under Content Layout, we're going to select this one. And when we hover our mouse over it, it should say Full Width Contained. Then we're going to click into Sidebar under this, and set it to this one in the middle, which is No Sidebar. Now we're going to click in the Advanced Settings at the bottom, which is going to open up this pop-up, and here we're going to change the Transparent Header to Enabled. And then click Return to Post in the bottom right. Then the last thing we need to do is hide the page title. To do this, we just need to hover over the page title, and then click the hide icon that appears in the top left. And at this point we'll see that our title's now grayed out, which means that although our page has a name, it won't actually appear on the page. And now we just need to save our page as a draft for the new changes to take effect. And we can do this by clicking Save Draft in the top right. Then once our page has been saved, we can start adding our content. But rather than doing this from scratch, we're going to import a page template using the Starter Templates plugin. To do this, we just need to click Template Kits in the top left. Then we could click into Patterns like we did before and build the page by adding a bunch of different sections. But instead we're going to import an entire page. So we just want to make sure Pages is selected at the top here. And then we can start looking through all the different sites we have to choose from. So we can just click into any of these sites. And here we'll see the different pages on the right. And then a preview of the page on the left. Now we can just click through the different pages on the right until we find the one we like. Or if we don't see one we like, we just need to click the back button in the top left and click into a different one. Then we can look for the page we want to use on the right. And for my example, I'm just going to use this one. Then once we find the page we're wanting to use, we can click Import Template at the bottom. And this is going to import the full template into the editor. Now we can preview our page. And we'll see that the new template has been added successfully. And it's also been updated to use the same fonts as the rest of our site. Then at this point we can close out of the preview. And now we just need to change the content in the same way as our other pages. So we can update the text and images, and add or remove any sections we like. But I'm just going to leave mine as it is to save time. Then once we're happy with our new page, we can click Publish in the top right, and then click Publish again. Then once it's published, we can click here where it says View Page, And we'll see that our new page is now live on our site. Now, obviously mine just looks the same as the template, as I didn't change anything, but the page has been successfully published. Now, you might have noticed that our new page isn't appearing in our menu, but this is super easy to do. So to add a page to our menu, we just need to click Customize in the top left, and this will open up our theme options. Now we're going to click into Menus on the left, and then click into Primary Menu. At this point, we'll see the page I deleted is still here, and it's showing an error, so we just want to remove this first. To do this, we just need to click on it, and then click where it says Remove at the bottom. Then to add the new page to our menu, we're going to click here where it says Add Items, and then on the right we're going to click on the new page we just created. And when we do this, we'll see that it's been added to the bottom of this list on the left. Now if we click here where it says Reorder, we can use these up and down arrows to change the position of the page in our menu. And when we do this, we'll see that it updates on the right. And for reference, anything we put to the top of this list will be on the left side of our menu, and anything we put to the bottom of the list will be on the right. Then, once we're happy with the order of our menu, we can click Done on the left. Then we can also change the name of any pages in our menu without affecting the actual page name. To do this, we just need to click on the page we're wanting to change. Then we can change the text in this box to whatever we like. And we'll see that it updates on the right. Then once we're done with our menu, we can click Publish at the top to save our changes. And then click the X in the top left to close out of these options. And at this point, we'll see our new page now appears in the menu. Now we're already on the new page, but if we click Home in our menu first, we can click back into the new page, and we'll see that everything's working as it should. Then the last page we have here in our menu is our contact page. And we can make any changes we like to the text, images and colours, or add or remove any sections we want. I'm just going to leave it all as it is to save time, but I do want to cover how to add a contact form in here so our visitors can get in contact with us, and also how to change the map at the bottom so it shows our location. So to get started, we're just going to click Edit Page at the top to open it up in the editor. Then if we look under this heading on the right, we'll see it says the form can't be displayed. So we're going to remove this block and add it again correctly. To do this, we just need to click on it, then click the three dots to the right of the menu, and click Remove WP Forms at the bottom. And this is going to remove the block. Now we need to take a new line by hitting the Enter key on our keyboard. Then we're going to click the plus symbol to the right, and this will let us add a new block. Now we're going to type the word Forms into this search bar, and click on WP Forms. And this will add the Forms block to the editor. Now we're going to click here where it says Select a Form, and then choose Contact Form. At this point, we'll see the contact form now appears in the editor, and this form asks for the user's name, phone number, email address, and their message, which is going to work for most websites. But if you'd rather have different fields in the form, I'll link to a video of mine in the description below that'll show you how to create a custom form instead. Then once we've added our form, we can preview the page. and we'll see that it's been added successfully. And now we're going to update the map at the bottom. So first we need to close out of the preview. Then we're going to open up a new tab in our internet browser and go to google.com/maps. Now we need to find the location we're wanting to show on our map using the search bar in the top left. Then once we find it, we're going to click where it says Share, and then click Embed Map in the middle. Now on the right we're going to click Copy HTML, and this will copy the embed code that represents our map. Then once we've got it copied, we can close out of Google Maps. And now we're going to highlight all of the text that's in this box at the bottom and delete it. Then we need to right click and paste in the code we just copied. And now we just need to make one simple change to this code. So if we look closely at the code, we'll see that it says width equals 600. And here we're going to change the 600 to 100%. Now we're going to keep the quote marks on either side of it. We just want to replace the 600 with 100%. And this is just going to make sure that our new map is the same size as the old one. Then once we're done here, if we preview our page, and scroll down, we'll see that the map has been updated and now shows our new location. Or if we want to remove the map altogether, we can close out of the preview. Then we're going to click on the code that represents the map, click the three dots to the right of the menu, and then click Remove Custom HTML at the bottom. But I'm just going to use the back arrow in the top left to undo this and bring it back. Then once we're happy with everything on our page, we just need to click Update in the top right to publish our changes. And now if we click View Page in the bottom left, we'll see that our changes are now live. So we have our new contact form here on the right. And if I just quickly fill this out, type a quick message, and click Submit, if I open up my email inbox, we'll see that I received the message as an email. And it's going to be sent to the email address we used when installing WordPress at the start. Then if we go back to our website, we'll see that the map has also been updated at the bottom and now shows our new location. And now that we've finished adding content to our pages, we're going to update our website's footer. And that's this part at the bottom of our website that shows on every page. So to update our footer, we need to click where it says Customize in the top left to open the theme options. Then we're going to click into Footer Builder on the left. And now if we look on the right, we'll see our footer area here. And then under this we have the different parts that make it up. And we're going to remove everything from this second row. So to do this, we just need to click the X to the right of each of them. And when we do this, we'll see the stuff is now gone in the preview above. Now our footer just consists of this line of text, which is known as our copyright text. To change this text, we just need to click where it says Copyright on the left. Then we can change the text in this box to whatever we like. And we'll see it updates on the right. Then under this on the left, we can also change the alignment if we like. But I'm just going to put mine back to the left. Now if we click into the Design tab in the top left, we can change our copyright text color here, and then our font size underneath. But I'm just going to put these back the way they were for mine. Then if we hover over our footer on the right, and click this little pencil icon, this will open up a different set of options on the left. And if we click into the Design tab at the top, here we can change the background color of our footer, and we'll see it updates on the right. But I'm just going to put mine back to white. Then once we're happy with our website's footer, we can click Publish at the top to save our changes. And then click the X in the top left to close out of the theme options. And now if we scroll down to the bottom, we'll see that our footer has been updated, and the colors will be different if we change them. And we're getting close to the end now. The last thing we need to do is update this action button in our menu. But just quickly before that, since you've made it so far through this video, be sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications for the channel. I release WordPress tutorials all the time that will help you improve your new website, and I'd love to have you as a subscriber. But anyway, let's get back to our website. So to update the button in our menu, we just need to open up our theme options again by clicking Customize in the top left. Then we're going to hover over the button itself on the right and click the little pencil icon above it. And now if we look over on the left, we have the different fields for the button. So first we can change the button text, and I'm going to change mine to say Coffee Tutorial. Then under this we need to paste in the URL we're wanting to link it to, and to save some time, I'm just going to paste in the same URL I used earlier. But if we wanted to link this button to a page on our own site, we just need to open up a new tab in our internet browser and visit our website. Then we can find the page we're wanting to link to, copy the URL from the top, and then come back and paste it into this box. Then if we're linking to another website, we need to turn on this switch beside where it says Open in a new tab. Then once we're done here, if we click into the Design tab at the top, we can change the button colors, size, and anything else we want. But I'm just going to leave mine the way it is, as I think it looks pretty good. Then once we're happy with our button, we can click Publish at the top to save our changes, and then click the X in the top left to close out of the theme options. At this point, we'll see our button's been updated, and when we click on it, it now links to the URL we used. And now, the very last thing you need to do is congratulate yourself because you just finished building your very own website and saved a bunch of money compared to hiring someone else to do it for you. So we have our different pages with our text and images and buttons. Then we also know how to create any new pages we need, and we can add or remove any of the different sections. Then over on our contact page, we also have our form, so our visitors can send us a message. And then we have our map at the bottom showing our location. We also have our menu here at the top, and our action button. Then, without us needing to do anything else, our website's also 100% mobile friendly. So if I just make my screen a little smaller, we'll see that everything resizes and rearranges itself so it's always going to look good on any device. So that's us now at the end of this tutorial, and I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please be sure to give it a like here on YouTube to show your support, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And if you know anyone else that would benefit from this video, be sure to share it with them as well. Then finally, if you have any questions about any part of the process, just leave them as a comment below and I'll try my best to help out. Once again, my name's Marty from letsbuildwp.com, and thank you very much for watching my video.